So you'll hear that. You'll hear it like that. So to introduce Amy, Amy Geller is a clinical social worker and a family therapist in private practice in Northern New Jersey. She received her BA from the George Washington University and her MSW from the NYU School of Social Work. Amy has extensive experience working with grief and loss in various hospice settings over the course of her career. And as an adoptee herself in her private practice, Amy provides psychotherapy to all members of the Adoption Kinship Network through a compassionate model of connection and attachment. Amy is currently pursuing a doctorate in social work at the Rutgers University School of Social Work, where she aims to amplify the voices amplify the voices and lived experience of people touched by adoption. She has a special interest in the impact of ambiguous loss on adoptive relationships. And with that, we welcome Amy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Betsy, for that generous introduction. I have to tell you, I'm really honored and humbled to be included in this Monday night series. I was kind of doing some research and seeing all the names and people that you've had before me and yet to come. And it's really, you've had quite an impressive lineup. I have to say, speaking here at the Adoption Network Cleveland is really an amazing experience, just listing the things that you have done in the last several decades, the advocacy and the resources, and I think most importantly, the inclusive community that you provide for all people touched by adoption and foster care. I think your mission aligns with mine over here in New Jersey, and that I aim to provide education and also expand the conversation in real ways about adoption. So I thank you for having me. Very cool that you and I were chatting before we got started, that we are able to connect with people from all over the United States tonight. I was checking out the registration list and I noticed we have people from California, Arkansas. I don't think I've ever even met anyone from Arkansas, Texas, and Hawaii. So welcome everybody from all over. I love that you're here to be part of this night. And the name Adoption Network Cleveland, we really have great representation from the entire adoption network tonight, just checking out all the registrations. We have many adoptees and adoptive and foster parents. We have birth parents, extended family, which is so important, professionals. And as is often the case, as is the case with myself, sometimes people have multiple hats within the adoption network. And I know many of you kind of identify with several of the categories. And then there was this category, this little category, other, which I find really exciting because that means that you don't identify as any of these people in the adoption network, and yet you came here to learn about adoption and loss and attachment. So that's really exciting to me. I don't know who you are, but I'm really glad that you are here. So there's no denying that in the last 5 years, I've been working in adoption for a little over 10 years. And in the last 5 or so years, Betsy, you'll probably agree with me, adoption has become, it's exploded as a topic in popular media. You cannot turn on the TV without seeing a documentary or a fictional TV show where adoption is a central character. The same goes for the New York Times bestseller lists. There are just books and memoirs, fiction, where adoption is really a prevalent character. And my hope is that some of the other category has just opened their minds and is expanding their interest in this very popular subject right now. So an example of that is, again, Betsy and I were talking before we got started here tonight, how when she started Adoption Network Cleveland back in the 80s, there was no internet, there was no place on Facebook to join groups and connect. I mean, people were really living the experience of adoption in isolation. And when there was representation on TV or in the media, I personally never really felt like it told the whole story. So it is great to see how far we've come with shows like one of my favorites, This Is Us. And I know that they are really conscientious about hiring adoptees to consult. And I know they've had transracial adoptees on the show to consult and to inform the character of Randall. And it is really helpful because I know for me, it's been helpful in people in my life kind of gaining a deeper understanding while watching these shows about the experience of the adoptee, of the birth parent, of the adoptive parent, and really kind of telling it from all the angles. So I'm going to say a little bit about myself. I know Betsy introduced me, but I come here wearing a lot of hats tonight. I am a social worker and a family therapist. Right now, I'm in full-time private practice in New Jersey, a little bit out of New York City, about 20 minutes, half an hour. And I now have the privilege and honor to work with all members of the Adoption Kinship Network. That includes birth parents, and I've worked with some biological fathers and adoptees of all ages, from teenagers on through adulthood into advanced age. And I work with a lot of adoptive moms. In fact, I recently concluded a support group for adoptive moms, which was incredibly eye-opening for me. And on top of that, I am also an adoptee. I was adopted at birth via private domestic adoption. My entire kinship network existed in the same community. It was a very small town affair. I was adopted by a same race family and what I call a mixed family, which means that I was raised by parents who had biological children of their own, and they discovered adoption through a neighbor who had pursued a family through adoption, and they became interested and curious and decided they would like to complete their family and to round out the troops with a girl. I am also an adoptee who has been in double reunion, which means that I have had reunion and met both of my biological parents, as well as extended family members from both sides. And as Betsy mentioned, I am also a first-year doctoral student at Rutgers University School of Social Work. The reason I decided to pursue that degree at this point was pure and simple 100% because of adoption. And as I started to do work in adoption, I was looking for research that supported what I was seeing in my office. I was also interested in learning theories and practice that would help me provide care to my adoptive families that I worked with. And I was frustrated when I found that a lot of what I was seeing did not accurately represent or jive with what people were sharing with me in my office. I also felt like adoptees were underrepresented in academia and also in research. So the Rutgers doctorate program allows me to pursue qualitative research, which really talks about the lived experience, the feelings, not the data and the facts and the numbers, although there's really good people doing really good research in those areas. For me, I'm interested in what's it really like. What does it feel like? What does it taste like? What does it smell like? And what can my work with people teach other people? How can it be applied across the board? So I'm hoping to engage in research that's going to positively impact the resources that are available and also practice methods. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover tonight. This presentation is about loss in adoption. I'm going to talk about that loss is universal in every single scenario. It is probably the one and only thing that you can say is in every scenario of adoption is loss. Somebody loses something. And I'm going to go on and I'm going to define a specific type of loss that I believe really applies to this adoption situation called ambiguous loss. And I'm going to explain what that is to you. And then I'm going to talk about why that's a particularly challenging type of loss. And we're going to explore that from various viewpoints. At that time, I may ask people who are part of the adoption network to weigh in the chat and say, you know, what they experienced as their losses associated with adoption. And then I'm going to go kind of turn it more towards the work I do here. And I'm going to talk about how this ambiguous loss, how the parallel experience of loss in an adoptive mother and adoptive child impacts that relationship. I'm also going to talk about how that parallel ambiguous loss is an opportunity for healing and attachment. And really what I'd like to do is talk a little bit at the end. I know this talk isn't geared towards mental health professionals, but more to the community at large. But I do want to talk a little bit about what I'm doing in my office to address ambiguous loss with the families I work with, and hopefully talk to you about how I provide these families hope and also provide you with hope. So to preface, before I get into the heart of the matter, I want to say that you cannot generalize to every situation. The one thing I will generalize is that loss is a part of every adoption scenario. Beyond that, I do not claim to know everything about adoption, and quite the opposite. I'm actually learning every single day. With every person who walks through this door, I learn more. I'm open to new perspectives. So while I feel like what I have to offer you here tonight is useful and can probably be applied across a lot of scenarios, I just want to preface by saying I am open to new perspectives, new ideas, your thoughts. Please share them with me during the Q&A. As most of us in the adoption world know, this is a very emotionally charged topic, even for people not directly touched by it. I talk about adoption often, it comes up a lot, more so in the last 10 years, and they can be challenging conversations. Birth moms, adoptive parents, and certainly adoptees all express that it can be tense, it can be frustrating, people can feel defensive or not seen or understood. And I've really kind of tried to reflect on why that is. Why is adoption such an emotional topic for people? And having reflected on it, I've come up with one theory. The truth is, to be human is to have a mother. We all have a mother, sometimes more. And adoption, and that's a really highly emotionally charged relationship, right? And adoption kind of turns that on its head. It challenges what it means to be a mother, challenges who gets to be a mother, what makes a good enough mother, who doesn't get to be a mother. And it can be triggering for most people, even in ways maybe they don't realize. So what I'm going to tell you about tonight is my goal in addressing all of you is to expand our understanding, and to do so through compassion and curiosity. So I'm going to ask every single one of you, regardless of what brings you here, to open your heart and open your mind and try and maybe set aside your cousin who was adopted in Washington, or something you might have seen on TV, or, you know, whatever your beliefs might be. And I'm going to ask you to try to take away from tonight one thing you didn't know about the experience of somebody who's been touched by adoption. And maybe to think about somebody you know in your own life and take what you've learned and share it with them, somebody who's been touched by adoption. Or even better, go and ask them and say, tell me something I didn't know. And if you are a member of the adoption triad here tonight, what I'm going to ask you to do is try to learn one thing from another perspective. So like, for example, if you're an adoptee, to try and learn something from the perspective of a biological parent or an adoptive parent. And I know Betsy had said that they are going to be sending out a questionnaire about the experience. So I would like you to reflect when you rate this presentation tonight, if you in fact were able to learn something that you didn't know before. Okay, last thing. So there's going to be a Q&A at the end of this meeting. And I will not be checking the chat unless I specifically say so, because I find it kind of distracting. But when I'm done speaking, there will be a Q&A, and I am going to just say what the ground rules are for that. There are no ground rules. I am an open book. You can ask me questions about my topic here this evening. You can ask me about my experience as an adoptee. You can ask me about my experience in reunion. I am open. If I can't answer or don't have the answer, we will figure out what to do from there. I will either point you in the right direction, I'll provide you with my email. But so certainly if you have questions, save them, put them in the chat, and Betsy will be providing them at the end. So what I want to do is, before I get into the heart of ambiguous loss, so I want to talk to you a little bit about how I got here doing what I'm doing, because I do believe it's very relevant to the topic and it's relevant to my story. I began my social work career. I did a very brief stint in a hospital, and I discovered hospice care, and I was very drawn to that. I guess I've always been kind of curious and interested about loss. And for hospice care, for those of you who don't know, it's not a place, it's a philosophy. And it is a philosophy that believes that death is a very normal and expected part of life. There is an end, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end is very normal. They viewed it sort of as a normal transition, just like birth. And there were many things I took from this experience that have really stood me in good stead as I have transitioned to working with adoptive families. Hospice care is based on a treatment platform that is multidisciplinary. So right off the bat, you do not just work in a little silo of social work. You work with a doctor and a nurse and a chaplain, which is amazing. I mean, there aren't that many jobs that you get to really holistically, work in that way. And lots of personal care employees. And the most important part to me is that you would engage family members in the primary care, which takes me to my next point. This job taught me how important the person is in the context of their family, and that what makes a family is truly the people that matter the most. It doesn't have to be necessarily the people that raised you or that you raised or your brothers and your sisters. In the hospice world, your family is whomever you felt safest with and closest with. And the definition was different for everybody. So in hospice, the power and importance of communication is stellar. And I would go into homes and I would usually be greeted at the door. And this is going to come back later in the adoption world, so bear with me. I would walk in the door and I would be greeted by a family member. And before I could even get to the patient, there would be the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper would say to me, listen, before you go in and meet my mother, I need you to know she's dying and she doesn't know it. But we know it and we don't want her to know because she can't handle it. Won't be good for her. And I'm like, okay, I understand. And then I would go meet the patient. And before long, the patient would say to me, listen, I need to tell you something. I'm dying. My family doesn't know it. And they can't know it because they won't be able to handle it. And so usually a lot of these scenarios would start off with, what do family members who love each other do? They protect each other, right? And they don't want to talk about the hard things. And meantime, everybody in the house knew and nobody was talking about it. And so a big part of my job was to facilitate communication. So just rounding the corner on the hospice stuff, I really kind of worked through and became quite an expert on loss and grief and bereavement. I spent many, many years doing it. And what I realized was there's no closure ever in loss. I think that's just not possible. There's transition and transformation. And so in this typical type of loss, life and death loss, there is change and transformation. And a big part of getting to that transformation is the importance of rituals and outlets to process the grief, which is why in hospice there would be a lot of opportunities during and after for bereavement, for support. We would do support groups for, up to a year after family members could come and get support. And as is the custom in many cultures and religions, there are lots of ways to acknowledge a life and death loss. So having done that for many, many years, I kind of decided I needed a break, and it was time for me to move on to my next challenge. So I was ready to move, and I decided to toss my hat in the ring at private practice. Now, what I loved about hospice and I wanted to take with me was working with families. I've always been interested in family therapy. And so I go into private practice and I expect to have a nice kind of balanced family therapy practice. And I hung my shingle and the phone started ringing. And I had no interest in working in adoption. It wasn't even on my radar, like not even a thing. But I got one referral after the other. And this is how it went. High school girls, ninth grade girls in particular, one after the other. And the parents would call me, usually mom, and she would say, I just don't know what's happening. Since she's in high school, she's changed her friend group, her grades are suffering, she seems anxious, she seems depressed, she seems both. She's really been aggressive, isolated, she's pulled away. And this was interesting to me too. She's really rejected me. She really likes my husband better than me. And I don't understand why, but we used to be so close and she's rejected me. And by the way, I don't know if this matters or not, but she was adopted. One after the other, the mom would say at the end of the phone call that the child was adopted. Now, at the time, I was happy and lucky enough to be in a supervision group with clinicians who were far more experienced than I. And I would go and present my cases, and they kept going back to this adoption thing. And I was like, I mean, they don't seem to think it matters. And then it came up that I was adopted myself. Well, now these therapists really leaned into the fact that this was like something I needed to look at. And after some time and convincing, I decided, yes, I did. There was something here. This was not an accident. Certainly, I wasn't looking for it, but maybe it was looking for me. And lean in, I did. And I leaned in. I leaned in professionally and personally. And the first thing I noticed was professionally that adoptees were way overrepresented everywhere in mental health care. Adoptees were more highly represented in therapist's office, in inpatient psychiatric hospitals, in long-term residential care facilities, in wilderness programs. And that's the thing that really got to me, is that the research I was finding was focused on the behavior of the adoptee as pathology. And what was happening was children were being sent away again from home to be treated. Now, you have to wonder what that does to an adoptee, right? To be sent away from home after they've already been separated from their first parent. So I remember calling a psychiatric hospital in Westchester that I sometimes referred clients to. And I asked my colleague that worked on the adolescent unit there, and I said, can you do me a favor? Would you mind looking at the charts just anecdotally? Could you look at the charts and I'm curious, I have a hunch about something. I said, how many of them have adoption in their history? She said, I'll check and I'll get back to you. And I said, I don't want any identifying information. I'm really just curious. She calls me back and she's like, you're not going to believe this. She said, it is like 3/4 of the kids on the unit right now. 3/4 of the kids on the unit. So now there's no turning back from this, right? I have to really kind of understand. But I'm frustrated because a lot of the other mental health professionals that I'm working with are kind of like they're not really trained in adoption. They don't understand it. You know, a lot of what I was finding was like interventions focused on working with kids who had reactive attachment disorder, which is a whole nother topic for another night. But so I was determined to figure this out for these kids. In the meantime, I also knew that I had to sort of figure this out for myself. And here I am, almost 40 years old, and I start really looking at how has being adopted impacted my life. And up until that point, and to this very day, I would tell you, I had a very happy childhood and a successful adoption in a family that I felt secure with. And yet, my eyes were being opened to all the ways that being an adoptee and being relinquished had impacted my life and were still impacting my life. And really, I decided as I got more confident to use myself as an adoptee in my work. And it was beautiful because many of the kids I worked with had never met an adopted person, let alone an adoptee who was an adult, like an adult version of themselves. And the adoptive parents were actually very welcoming of the idea too, because here they saw me as sort of a mentor for their child, but also they could ask me questions and they saw an adult version of their child in front of them. So personally and professionally, everything sort of started to kind of meld together and intertwine. And I got to the point where I realized I was sort of myopic in my approach to adoption. I was kind of only looking at it from a teenage girl perspective. And I admit that I saw ninth grade me in a lot of these ninth grade girls. And so I thought I need to go deeper and bigger with this. And so I started to bring the adoptive moms into the process. Sometimes the dads too, but it just so happens it would usually be the moms. And I would really be curious and compassionate and say, what's it like? What's it like to be an adoptive mom? What's it like to raise a child and to go through things and maybe it wasn't what you expected? And I learned a lot. And then I realized I had had no access or conversation with anybody who ever relinquished a child into adoption. I didn't really understand the birth mom perspective. And I had sort of gone all over the place in my mind in relation to my birth mother growing up. But we were not in a place where we could meet yet. We weren't either of us ready for reunion. But there are really amazing birth moms out there. Ashley Mitchell is one of them. She has an organization called Need and Knee, where she advocates and provides support for the birth mother community. And through her, I was able to connect with several birth moms who gave me a lot of emotional time on the phone to talk about what was it like to be a birth mother and to have an adoptee call them and ask them, what is that like? Tell me, because I'm working with people and I want to know. And the thing that came up, the thing that connects all of this is loss, that all the parties involved shared loss. And they were all feeling it and dealing with it in isolation, unable to share it with other members of the triad. So along the way, I had the good benefit of taking a course at Rutgers, the social work department, with Dr. Tawanda Hubbard, who specializes in oppositional behavior in adolescents. Not really an adoption topic, but sort of a side topic to adoption and oppositional behavior. The cool thing about Dr. Hubbard is she explores oppositional behavior, not in terms of pathology, but in terms of communication. What is oppositional behavior trying to say to us? And in this class, Dr. Hubbard introduced me and the rest of us to the concept of ambiguous loss, one I hadn't really heard of before. By the way, Dr. Hubbard is giving her workshop on oppositional behavior in adolescents again this week on Wednesday. I think you can still sign up. So that's a little plug. I highly recommend it if you have a teenager or if you have ever been a teenager. So ambiguous loss, what is it? Ambiguous loss was coined by Pauline Boss in the 1970s. And this was her attempt to kind of capture all of the losses that don't fall under the black and white life and death type of traditional loss that people face. All these kind of disenfranchised losses, and even more, these losses that sort of never have an end or a defining like certain outcome. So she came up with two types of ambiguous loss. The first one is both of these types kind of exist on a continuum of presence versus absence. The first type of ambiguous loss is that where the person is still here, but who they are to you is no longer available to you. Their soul or their essence is gone. The classic example of this, having gone through this with my best friend, is when your parent or loved one has Alzheimer's disease. And there's a point where they no longer exist as the person you knew them to be. However, their body is still there. You can hug them and kiss them, and they still need loads of care. And it's almost like people will often say, it feels like I lost them years before they actually were gone. And so in that period of time, those people experiencing that's one type of ambiguous loss. They can't really get on with their lives and they can't grieve, but they also lost somebody. The second type of ambiguous loss is the kind that's really, I'm going to focus on as it relates to adoption. And that is where somebody is physically gone, but psychologically very present, and usually physically present somewhere else in the unknown, somewhere we don't know, but we are still in a relationship with them, and psychologically they very much matter to us. Examples of this might be when somebody goes off to war or to military service. Another example is somebody who's gone missing, and it's just open-ended, and these cases that never get solved. I know Dr. Boss did a lot of work around 9/11 for people who had family members in the Twin Towers, where there were periods of years where people didn't know if their loved one was still alive or not. And so certainly they weren't prepared to have funerals or move on with their lives. So what I propose is that ambiguous loss is the kind of loss we're talking about here in adoption. And I'm going to look at it and illustrate it from each aspect of the adoption triad. So starting with, every adoption story starts with birth parents. A child is conceived, and while I'm talking about this, I'm going to invite anybody who considers themselves a birth parent, if you want to share in the chat any losses that you would identify for yourself as part of being a birth parent. Because like I said, I'm always learning. But birth parents conceive a child, and somewhere along the way, the decision is made by them or for them that somebody else should raise that child. And so there's a loss of a child. And even if at that time the birth parent feels this is a really wonderful decision and they're all in, the birth moms I've talked to have said that this loss changes and morphs over time, and that it never goes away. And this could also be a birth father who may not even know that the child was born or that the child exists. And there's a loss of status, as there's usually shame and secrecy around this kind of loss. Next, I'm going to talk about the loss for the adoptee, right? The birth parent loses a child and the adoptee loses parents. And what that child loses is those biological parents, their origins, their history, their medical information. In transracial adoptions, they can lose their culture, growing up with people who look like them. And I want to invite people who consider themselves adoptees to, if you'd like to express any other losses that you have had, you can put those in the chat as well. And Betsy, if you're seeing them and you want to interrupt me and call them out, be my guest. So it's pretty widely established, right, that there is this ambiguous loss. You may not have known what it was called, but for the birth parents and the adoptee. The thing that's really interesting to me is turning the lens to the adoptive parents. I think historically, adoptive parents are seen as, yes, a loss of identity. I mean, I often call adoption the child witness protection program, because you are literally given a whole new identity. So for adoptive parents, we see them as the beneficiary, that they are gifted a child to raise as their own, and they are given the opportunity to become parents. What I didn't realize was how much loss there was in the adoptive parent community. Now, I know there's many reasons why people adopt. And again, like I said, you can't generalize. But what I've learned is that adoptive parents, 80% of them have experienced infertility. This number keeps coming up in the research. And so a good percentage of parents who adopt have first gone through infertility treatment. And the success rates for infertility treatments are pretty low, all things considered. They're about 30%, which means that many people who pursue reproductive technology, infertility, are not able to have a child. And so at one point or another, they may consider adoption as the only way to become a family. I'm just checking the chat, excuse me, because transracial adoptee, a loss of parents due to racially political differences, but chosen to not be in my life and actively gaslight. I think a lot of birth parents and adoptees experience disenfranchised grief. All true. So what I learned in my research, going back to the adoptive parents, was that there's a lot of loss before they even adopt. And going through infertility treatments is exhaustive, and it is very focused on the end goal. And sometimes parents actually will start pursuing adoption and still pursue infertility. Other times parents will stop infertility treatment and they will pursue adoption. But there's really no space in there to handle or deal with that grief. And a lot of infertility programs don't address that. And by the time you've moved on to adoption, that is also an exhaustive process. And for people who have become parents, you know that drive is completely overpowering. And so what happens with that ambiguous loss, that loss of a wish or a dream? And I do think we have to kind of normalize that it's okay that parents want to become parents biologically first. I think we have to be careful not to shame parents for that, because what that does is shuts that part of their conversation down. And so they wind up taking that and living with that. And what I'm going to say is, I believe that that loss for those parents and the loss suffered by the adoptee, the parallel ambiguous loss impacts the adoptive relationship. And so where I want to take this before I conclude is what I've chosen to do with it. And that is to change the focus from the pathology of the adoptee into the relationship, the family relationship, going back to that hospice conversation of like opening up the tough conversation. Because what I started to see was the adoptee would come in and talk about curiosity about birth parents, having questions about being adopted. And the adoptive mother might talk about, you know, when I would really dig deep into like, what brought you here to adoption? What was life like when you adopted? There was a lot of sort of reticence to talk about the experience of loss and infertility and maybe pregnancy losses that led up to adoption. And yet it all sort of hangs out there in the family. So basically, I wanted to take the focus away from the problem behavior and get underneath it and ask what is going on here in the family. And so Dr. Boss says ambiguous loss is a relational phenomenon, which means it cannot be dealt with in the individual space. It has to be dealt with relationally. And so what I've been doing in my office is working on, there's no closure for these types of losses, but what you can do is build resiliency and attachment. And the parallel experience of loss, I believe, is a doorway, is an entryway to attachment. And every work you do with an adopted person should be around attachment and building bonds. So I'm going to just talk very quickly about a few things that I do, because I see that I'm over time and I'm running out of time, and I want to make sure people have available time to ask questions. But some of the things that I've been doing are bringing the parent into the room and engaging the parent, right? We want attachment. So it would make sense that we would bring the parent into the room with the child and we would identify the losses. And I know this is scary for a lot of people to think about talking about your infertility loss with your teenage child, but it really gives the child permission to talk about what they lost. And it really opens up to have this narrative that is honest and real and tells the whole story. So by building this communication, we can then look at how we want to grieve these losses, because society doesn't really allow any recipe for dealing with this. And one of the most important things, like I learned in hospice, is rituals for dealing with grief. So I like to work with families on creating their own. And oftentimes this will involve rituals for grieving a relationship with biological parents or honoring and celebrating biological parents, but also potentially grieving the loss that the adoptive mother may have experienced before, and not shaming her for having wanted that, but sort of accepting that this is the narrative the family has taken on. It also makes room for the fact that sometimes parents do go on and have biological children after they adopt. One really cool thing that I'm doing in my office on this TV screen behind me is I like to do genograms. And a genogram is basically a fancy psychological family tree. For those of us who are adopted, we all did family trees growing up, I'm sure. I don't know if they still do it in school, but it was kind of awkward. And what I like to do is a living, breathing genogram in the office with family members, and we add everybody and we tell the whole story. And it is a living, breathing kind of document that we can change over time as curiosities develop or if conversation about potential reunion comes up. But it includes the entire family. And it is so eye-opening often for adoptees, adult adoptees too, to see themselves in black and white in that way here in my office. And I can email it to them and we can make a copy. So the last thing I want to talk about is just normalizing the ambivalence in adoption. My own mother, who raised me, gave me the gift of teaching me that word when I was a little girl. And it was such a gift because it is a normal part of life, but especially for people touched by adoption. And basically what it means is you can be happy and sad at the same time. You can be sad that you were given up and happy you were adopted at the same time. And I think a big part of when I work with families in my office is like teaching that word and making it okay to feel all the things associated with adoption. It is through this mutual empathy that we really start to see attachments build. And it's amazing how a lot of the diagnoses and the behaviors start to fall away, and how there is now this new story, this new narrative that a family can go forward. And it is from that place that hopefully they can leave my office and have some hope for the future. And I hope that this gives you some hope for the future. So I want to thank you for listening. And I am open to questions at this time.
Thank you, Amy. That was great. Not a whole lot of questions so far. One person asked when you were talking early on about the 9th grade daughters that the mothers were calling you, and this person wanted to know if you saw a high rate of transracial adoptions or same race adoptions or a mix.
I see a mix in the community that I live in. It's interesting. A lot of the kids I work with were adopted early, like right at birth, from all over the country. And then I do have a significant number of girls who were adopted from China. Now, they're sort of coming of age now. The girls who were adopted during the one-child ruling in China. So it's a mix. I don't see a lot of boys. I do believe that there are gender differences in the experience of adoption. It's kind of probably a whole nother talk. But I tend to see more female adoptees in my practice.
Thanks. We also had an adoptee who shared that her mom is gone now, but that this adoptee had once asked her mom to admit that she would have rather given birth, rather given birth than have adopted a child. And then her mom responded that what she wished is that she had given birth to her. So,
That's beautiful. And
yeah,
I believe it. I mean, that's the complexity of adoption, right?
yeah, yeah, kind of both and, right?
Right.
Someone is asking if you experience any rough patches in your own reunion, if you'd like to share.
Sure. So yes, I would say reunion is not to be done impulsively. And I would recommend that reunion not be done without a lot of work prior to prepare. Um, I think a lot of people have the idea that reunion is an event, that it is an event that provides closure and answers. Reunion is actually often just the beginning of a relationship. And the truth is, whether you ever have reunion or not, you are in a relationship with your biological parents. It's just maybe like to this point of ambiguous loss, it's ambiguous. I had a bumpy reunion with my biological father. I feel I had a complete experience. He has passed on now, but there were some rough patches. I had a lot of support from friends and a therapist and my husband. And, yeah, there were some rough patches. And I am pretty newly in reunion with my birth mom. So far, so good. I made sure that both of us had our own support in place. And I don't know what's going to happen yet.
Thanks. We had a question. I don't know if you would know the answer to this or not, but were there fertility treatments in the 1960s is the question.
In doing my research, it seems like fertility treatments really became much more prevalent and popular in the late 70s. But that said, I know I was born in 1970, and my own mother had she didn't go through infertility treatments, but she really wanted a girl, and she told me that there were sort of assisted fertility kind of things floating around in the late 60s.
Okay. Thanks.
Looks like Molly might have her hand up.
Yeah, we had a couple questions in chat. Molly, did you want to ask a quick question directly?
No, it's okay. The question that's about rituals will be more interesting, so we'll go ahead and answer that one. That'll be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So if we have time at the end, we'll circle back. So we had a question about the experiences of children in foster care. How are they the same or different from children who have been adopted?
From different from children who've been adopted at birth? Well, I mean, I think children in foster care, I've worked with children who have been in foster to adopt situations. And I've worked with kids who've been adopted out of institutional foster care. Admittedly, in the community that I live in, I don't work with a lot of foster care, but what I can tell you is that that is compound loss, because children are attaching and unattaching, and they are losing not only their biological parents, sometimes when they're a little bit older, so they've already attached to their first parents, but then they may have several foster situations. And so the losses just keep building.
Thanks. And then we have a question that really gets to, maybe some of your specific techniques. So what are some of the rituals that you've helped families to create to acknowledge ambiguous loss?
So a lot of times they will start with what we know about the biological parents. And it's tricky, right? It takes a lot of help and counseling to kind of support. Sometimes the adoptive parents are very afraid of that, or scared to lose their own status as the primary parent. But a lot of times it will start with, what do we know about where you came from? Do you have anything from your first parents? A lot of times that'll be like bringing that in. I know sometimes people will have the books that they made as prospective adoptive parents. So we'll bring those in and we'll kind of take those books apart and we'll create a new book. One ritual that I really love is that of writing a family memoir. I love memoir. I feel like many adoptees are working on them, but what I like to do is encourage a family to work on one together, which really tells all aspects of the story. And I've had some people do some really beautiful collage type memoirs that they take with them. One girl I worked with, the family made a candle. They brought stuff in to make a candle, and they had kind of put like little trinkets in it that they had gone to Michael's and bought a bunch of stuff, but and they took it home and it sits on their coffee table.
Thanks. And we have time maybe for one more question. What were some of the effects of being an adoptee that you observed in your own adult life, and how did you address those or overcome those?
Okay, that is a big question, but I will give you the elevator version of it. It is something I do love talking about. So I looked at my own life and I said, how has adoption impacted me? I mean, until this point, I was really thinking like it kind of hadn't. Many adoptees call that being in the fog. And as I started to look, I had this one big thing staring me right smack in the face. I had gotten married and I had had children, and then I got divorced pretty quickly. And I'll spare you the details, but I was single for a very long time. And I kind of was very focused. I was successful in my career. I had a 20-year best friend. I had all these friends, and I could not keep a relationship. I just couldn't do it. Things would get hard. 3 months would hit and I'd be out. I'd find a reason and I'd be like, this isn't for me. And I will tell you that exploring adoption and how it impacted my life, and really looking at the way that that was actually, maybe it wasn't everybody else. Some of it was me. And I'm proud to say that, because I do feel I know a lot of adult adoptees who are in a similar experience, and I've learned a lot about that. So that's sort of a side topic that I want to work on and help adult adoptees find love in their life, because I will tell you, it's really worth it and it's wonderful. And but I had some stuff to figure out before, and to open my heart and allow myself to attach in that way. Instead, I kind of went the other way, and I was doing this very type A, very busy, very safe lifestyle. And I was missing out on some really good things life had to offer. So.
Great, thanks. Molly, we have a couple minutes if you want to quickly ask your question. I don't know if it's a short question or a long question, but go ahead.
Thanks. Awesome. I just wanted to, I guess my thought is kind of based on what I was saying earlier. I'm a transracial adoptee, and my parents are still living, but they're kind of just decided that they don't really want to be in a relationship. They gaslight, they say things that are not true about myself and my twin sister who were adopted together. So I don't know, is that anything you see in your research at all? Or is that anything you know, would that fall in line with what you're talking about? And, just kind of what do you think about that?
So that is a heavy question, and it is a very valid and legitimate question. And I hear it all the time. There's a lot of gaslighting in adoption, because basically, so I found this book while I was doing research, and in this book, it's called A Shared Fate. I recommend you look at it. In the 70s, I don't know, Betsy, if you're aware of this book, but I'm sure you are. This guy all the way back in the 70s was talking about how families needed to acknowledge the differences of adoption, and that this was really going to provide a better outcome for children. However, that's not the narrative that kind of was sold to adoptive parents, even now to this day, really, sometimes. Instead, it was kind of like, get the baby, go on with your life. It's a blank slate. And sadly, that kind of does result in what feels like gaslighting for a lot of adoptees, because there's this inherent need to deny what's really happened. It's not an uncommon experience or way to feel. And I certainly would recommend that One thing you might want to look into is there's somebody doing research, Amanda Baden here at Montclair State. Her work is about microaggressions in adoption, and I feel like that's kind of a side topic to gaslighting, the ways that people kind of shut down your feelings and your conversation when you try and talk about being an adoptee. So, but yes, very real. And, you know, if you want to email me, I can kind of point you in some right directions in addressing that.
Thank you. The author of Shared Fate is David Kirk, if anybody's interested, Kirk.
Yes.
So
Blew
great.
my mind to read that, because I was like, this is, I mean, it really was wise and sage and groundbreaking. And I don't know how much it really has changed things.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to wrap things up. You're getting lots of kudos in the chat. People are really enjoying the presentation. A lot of people saying they want to learn more about ambiguous loss. I think it's a great topic and one that has not been explored enough. So thank you for bringing it here to us this evening. And maybe we'll have that be a topic of one of our general discussion meetings, because
I would love it. I mean, I'm
explored.
going to be spending the next 3 years of my life living and breathing it. So I'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, thanks. I just put a link to a brief program evaluation in the chat. It's helpful for us to know your thoughts about how this program was for you, what future ideas you have, if you want to share any ways that you might use the program that we've had together this evening, that would be of interest. And so please, I think that's only 7 or 8 questions. Please take a minute to fill that out for us. I'm also putting a link to our calendar so you can see some of the different things that are coming up. And I want to thank everybody that joined us this evening, and Amy especially for sharing your wisdom and volunteering your time to be with us here tonight. As many of you know, Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization that serves individuals and families affected by adoption, impacted by adoption, and foster care and kinship care through support, education, and advocacy. To find out more about our organization and to join our work, you can see our website, which is adoptionnetwork.org. All the different links that I put in there will lead you to the website. And I hope that you'll consider joining us as a member. Hope to see you next month, and maybe before. As I mentioned earlier, we're consistently adding new speaking series, and we've got lots in the works. So thanks for joining us this evening, and have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.
Bye.